Or let's talk about the different generations of FSR. FSR1. First was FSR1. And this thing was spatial upscaling. So spatial upscaling is actually not really that new. Spatial upscaling is something that has been used in the professional world. For example, if you're going to remaster an old film, let's say a resolution of, say, 720p, which is roughly 1 million pixels, and it can turn this into an image, like an output image, that is, say, 1080p, which has, this is roughly 2 million pixels. When you think about the difference between 720p and 1080p, you're talking about doubling the pixels. In order for a GPU to run a game at 1080p versus 720p, it literally needs to be able to deal with twice the number of pixels. This is the reason why when we think about graphics cards 10 years ago, so that would have been, 2013, 1080p was really the target resolution that most hardware engineers building GPUs and also game designers, game developers, they were targeting a 1080p resolution as the final output resolution for their image. So they were working with 2 million pixel, roughly speaking, 2 million pixel canvas, so to speak, in terms of where they would render the game to the viewport, which would ultimately be on the display. I think a lot of people, unless you're somebody who works in video editing, you're probably not going to be familiar with this, but we're about to talk about the underlying technology behind FSR1 and how it works. It uses a mathematical function, it turns out. The way FSR works is it uses a kind of filter, which is essentially a sync function, but it is called the Lanczos. So Lanczos is the underlying secret function. I say secret, but it's not really a secret. It's essentially a sync function that is used to spatially upscale a given image. Let's say I have pixels that are right next to each other here. Yeah, let's do 5 by 5. So imagine if this is all, I'm just going to say this is like a 5 by 5 cube, right? The colors will differ. So I might have, say, blue pixels here. The top row might be all blue pixels. And then I might have blue pixels like here, here, and here. And I might have one down here. But then somewhere in there, I might have a different color. Let's say I've got orange. Let's say I've got orange pixels here. Okay, and then everything else here is like orange. Let's just to keep things simple, let's just use 2 colors. So what ends up happening is within this sample of a 5 by 5 grid of pixels, the algorithm can say, okay, there is kind of a pattern here where these pixels are kind of on a boundary, like, no, not that one, but these are touching. They're adjacent to pixels that have different color ranges within them. So it tries to kind of fit this together in the upscaled image so that you don't get weird artifacts in color due to negative color values or colors that just don't match. When you blow the picture up to a higher resolution, because we're upscaling, it tries to reduce the errors in color, which could result in artifacts, ringing, etc., in terms of over sharpened looking output or shimmering as you're moving the camera around. These are the sort of limitations with the Lanczos function. What AMD had to do for FSR is they had to introduce additional features such as color clamping. So what that means is, like I just said, if we have a region within the image where adjacent pixels have different colors, we're going to apply kind of a lock, so to speak, where the colors won't change for the next frame, or I guess the upscaled frame, I should say, because we're not talking about FSR3 yet. When you upscale, you're going to have more pixels than you started with. So you kind of have to set a lock in areas where the colors differ in terms of the boundary. Otherwise, you'll end up getting this weird... You'll see effects where, like as you move the camera, if you're looking at like a lamppost or like a phone line or something, that wire in the scene will kind of fade in and out real fast as you're panning the camera around. That's because this sort of thing is there. There's a difference in the color. The color might be the blue sky versus the phone line, in the background, where that skinny little wire of phone line is vanishing and appearing and vanishing and reappearing as you pan the camera around because of this effect. Because when it's upscaled, the color data in the newer pixels that are added, because now we're going from a 5x5 grid to something like a 15x15 grid or a 30x30 grid, or whatever the output resolution ends up being. So you have to introduce things like color clamping or locking pixels so that they maintain the same color in the same position of the overall image and that sort of thing. So there's more to it than just using a Lanczos filter. So FSR2 was what a lot of people refer to as temporal upscaling. Now, the other thing too to note is that none of this has been relying on any kind of deep learning or machine learning. Although with FSR2, they do use a form of machine learning, but they don't use it in real time on the GPU. The machine learning was used internally to train the algorithm to figure out what is the optimal way to apply these post-processing effects when you're doing upscaling to minimize these negative effects that we're seeing with FSR1. And then once that algorithm was optimized through machine learning, that was what was then put in the driver stack for FSR2 to basically do a one-size-fits-all sort of solution. So the nice thing about this is it is open source, as you can imagine. It's easy to integrate into any game, potentially any application that uses kind of frame upscaling technology or has those sort of requirements. It also supports multiple quality modes, so you can do things like dynamic resolution scaling. That was something that you couldn't really do with spatial-based upscaling because you were taking a fixed input image and you're basically blowing it up to a larger size and trying to minimize or prevent details from being lost in that output image. That was what FSR1 did. But FSR2 improved upon that because it allows for dynamic resolution scaling. A lot of people don't like dynamic resolution scaling. I know when Starfield launched, the actual presets that Starfield uses leverage dynamic resolution scaling. And a lot of people didn't like that because they thought, well, hey, it's kind of like they're cheating to achieve these frame rate targets for these presets because they're relying on dynamic resolution to do that. And the way that they leverage dynamic resolution is through the FSR development kit. FSR2 is a temporal upscaler, so when you think about that, it means that unlike spatial upscaling, it needs the information on camera jitter, and it needs the information for the depth buffer to determine the vector data. And when I say vector data, I'm talking about the movement of an object on the screen as you think of like a ball that's moving on the screen and then it like bounces and then goes off toward a wall. That movement, there is a vector associated with the direction that ball is moving. Is it moving toward the screen? Or is it moving away from the screen? Is the ball going to get smaller as it moves away from the screen? Is it going to get larger as it approaches the viewport of the gamer playing the game? Like, what is the motion vector associated with that? So this is something that FSR2 takes into account because it actually leverages the depth buffer to figure out the motion vector data so that it can use that info to eliminate or at least drastically minimize the artifacts and the negative effects that we're seeing with FSR1. So that's kind of what it does to improve the overall upscaled image. And by and large, it's significantly better.